Whoa, for the longest time. For the longest time. Sup kids, so as the title suggests, you may think that I am stepping into a hornet's nest of discussing race and culture. Which I am. I can't deny that. Every time I step into discussing something, I'm potentially stepping into a bit of a hornet's nest. This one more so because, I'm white. I know the cat's out of the bag on that one, and shockingly, I'm identified as a white male, which has lots of concept and symbology and privilege and all these things attached to it, which you can't really avoid. This is kind of like the starting point of this, is you can't really avoid it. There's a lot of things attached to this, so we're going to try and work through that as we discuss what I wanted to discuss, which essentially just breaks down to one clearly defined line: is that I have never had to prove that I am white. Some people may be thinking I've gone insane. You may be right. So, recently, I say recently, literally last night. Last night I went to a gig. It was a fantastic gig. It was at the engine shed in the town where I live. And it was a orchestral rendition of Dr. Dre's 2001 album. Now, first off, that sounds like the whitest event you can kind of imagine. But we went to this gig, and it's not the first rap gig I've been to. It certainly won't be the last rap gig I'll go to. I've been to rap shows before, and they've always been a little bit awkward, and they've always been a little bit weird. But a comment came up a couple of times in the night, which I was already thinking about discussing this whole concept of race and culture for myself. But a comment came up a couple of times in the night, which really resounded with me, and I just kind of stuck in my head. So it was this idea of, we were at this show, and it was such a diverse crowd. It was a crowd of, I don't know why it was so diverse, and I think maybe just the age of the album kind of locked into that. So the album was released 2001, as the title suggests, or 2000ish. I think actually, I'm not going to get beaten up by rap critics here, but it was released 2000ish. So that was 19 years ago now. So you've got a lot of generations back then who would have picked up that album. It was a huge album culturally. It's one of the albums which kind of other massive rappers like Eminem blew up on. It was Dre and Eminem were starting their whole empire of rap. It was around the time when like Eminem Show was going to be coming out and all these different things. So there's a huge thing with it, and it was one of those albums where you may not know the tracks, you may not know like the specific titles or the lyrics or anything like that, but you definitely know the songs, because if you watched any video where a rap track is used, or weed is discussed, or Dre or Snoop Dogg or Exhibit kind of pops up, the chances are you've heard one of those tracks. It's one of those albums. It's one of those albums which kind of everybody knows. You instantly know two songs. There's a next episode, which most people know because it's the one which ends with "Smoke weed every day." That's the last line of the song. And then "Forgot About Dre," and that's the album on the track. So you got these huge tracks. And we went to this show, and this show was basically a homage to Dr. Dre, done in kind of a little bit of a different way. They had violinists, cellists, I believe the word is trombone player, bassist, drum kit. It was nice. It was real nice, and they were an amazing band. The company which put it on is called No Strings Attached, and the guy doing the vocals, he was amazing, and he played all the parts needed for every song. And did it seamlessly. Didn't even have a backup vocalist to help him out. He was just going for it, and it was fantastic. But we were at this show, and this crowd, as I say, it was really diverse. It was predominantly white though, but that's not unusual, because I live in the UK, and the UK, whilst we have a multiculturalism, is predominantly white compared to places like the US. There's much higher percentile of white people, white immigrants as well, just in general. That's just kind of like one of those facts. So when you go to a show like this, you're going to see the majority of that. Lincoln itself as a place is extremely white. Race is one of those things where you notice it more the more you leave Lincoln. You go to places like Leeds and Sheffield, and you notice that the multi-ethnicity of the city is much higher. So Lincoln's a pretty white place. But we were at this show, and you got like 60-year-old guys, and couples, mature business couples, and then all the way down to kind of your students and your stoners and people who were just there because of the chronic and all this kind of stuff. And then, we fit somewhere in between, which is people in their 20s to 30s, young professionals, just, young people in their 20s doing whatever. People who know this album because when it came out in the 2000s, I'd have been 10, 11, 12. So it was a hugely influential piece. Eminem was a big part of that, and the whole me growing up thing. It inspired a lot of what my interest is in rap today. I've kind of deviated away from the Eminems and the Dre's now, more into the Aesops and the Atmospheres. But that's a whole other podcast. That's a whole other musical episode podcast. But the comment which I'm getting to is that I have never felt so white at a gig in my entire life. And a couple of friends, we all said this. We never felt so white. And why did we never feel so white? And it was perfectly natural for us to feel extremely white and to feel a little uncomfortable, because we were at a live show with an almost entirely white orchestra, performing an album which is synonymous with rap culture, which is black culture, part of black culture. I'm not going to just flat out that. Singing about things which we will never relate to. Singing about the excessive drug use, gangs, the NWA, Compton, all these things which we will never have any real, relation to. And yet, we're in this crowd, we're really enjoying ourselves. We know all the songs by heart. We know all the tracks, all the lyrics. And it's completely foreign to us. So it was completely natural to feel a little uncomfortable. But it did get me thinking. And what it kind of got me thinking on was something which I've already been thinking on, was that a friend of mine who's on YouTube, Chris Sanders, he does great pieces on the idea of black identity and black culture. A lot of the stuff he looks at is how kind of the nerd interests and black culture kind of mix together, and how that can be extremely bad, essentially, and how there's a lot of problems facing that blend of society and culture. As well, he's just recently posted a video about Black History Month and the things which are going on currently in the news, and he always goes really in depth, and I always find it fascinating and really interesting, because as a white guy, the race conversation is fascinating to me, and part of the reason it's fascinating and not terrifying is because I'm white, so I'm privileged, and that's fine. That's just how it is. That's what needs to change, but that's where I'm sat. So getting back to the point. See, this is the idea that it being a hornet's nest discussing race, I'm going to end up going back and forth. But what is the point you're trying to make, Graham? Oh, the point I'm trying to make. I forgot all about that bit. Okay. So, it got me thinking this whole idea that I've had black friends, I've had Asian friends, people from all different backgrounds, and a lot of them see their race and their culture as a huge part of their identity, and can even become insecure about the idea of proving that. And this whole question arose in my mind because I've heard it come from black friends of, oh, I can't do that, or I can't explore this because it's not black enough. Am I black enough? That becomes a whole question. And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. And then I realised that it's also come from Asian friends of mine. They're like, yeah, this is, or it's too Asian. Some things are too Asian. I can't do this because it's too Asian, or I can't do this because I don't feel Asian enough. And how different societies and cultures will ostracize those people who aren't adhering enough to, in a way, the stereotype. There's that episode of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air when Carlton gets basically called out by people. It's not sorority, that's not the word. Is it a frat? I think it's a frat. Either way, he gets called out about his culture because obviously he's a rich black guy. And he gets called out, and he goes on to this big speech about how it shouldn't matter how he dresses, what his musical interests are, that he's still facing the same problems that every other black male is facing. And it's a hugely powerful piece. I suggest you go YouTube it if you don't. It's like Carlton Banks stands up for himself or something like that. But it's this huge thing, and it basically triggered into my mind this whole idea of, I'm 29. I have never had a moment in my entire life where I've thought, am I white enough? And that seems weird to me right now because I'm considering it. But that's essentially what everyone, I don't know anyone who's sat and gone, am I too white? Am I too white? Am I not white enough? Am I sitting here going, oh, I wonder if I'm adhering to white culture enough? And that's, in a way, that's part of the kind of, not the problem, but the whole not mythology, theory behind it all. So it opens up this whole question of what is white culture. And my personal opinion is there isn't really a definitive answer to this. White culture as a process, as a symbol, as a whatever concept you want to define it as, comes as quite a vague term, and it's, in a way, it's intentionally vague. It's intentionally vague because it's allowed and has allowed and does allow us to kind of put our fingers into everything. And that's something which has gone on for literally forever. So this whole idea of defining something which is extremely white becomes quite odd to me. And yet it exists. It exists every day. What I did find interesting, so I did a little bit of Googling prior to this because I wanted to do a little bit of research, and I found some interesting things. First off, did you know that if you search white stereotypes, you don't really get any results? There's no kind of like straight to page of people listing white stereotypes. There is a fantastic article called What is White Culture Exactly on The Guardian, which I read, describing things, and I'll get back to it in a minute. But what I found more interesting / more hilarious is that you can search white stereotypes and nothing will come up. But if you search white girl stereotypes, you get a whole list. You get a whole list of white girl stereotypes, and I found that incredibly interesting. That as a society, as white people, or even outside of white people, that we've decided that females can have the stereotype, but males can't. And yet I know of white male stereotypes. There's a few things which kind of get flagged with me as white guy stereotypes. For instance, Pokemon cards. That's a pretty white guy stereotype. That was kind of there. But also metal music, an interest in metal. That is quite a white person stereotype because a lot of metal music was born out of Eastern Europe, which is predominantly white. And so, yeah, it's just like little things. And there was, a friend of mine I kind of met for a while just said, this is such a white guy thing to do quite a few times. So they do exist, but we just don't flag them. And I found that interesting. Coming off the list of white girl stereotypes, I read through it and I don't even know if these are real, because a lot of these I put down just to plain marketing. Like one of them is to love Starbucks, to love Katy Perry. And to me, they're not stereotypes. That's just mass advertising. You can't really avoid liking those things. I'm not a fan of Katy Perry, by the way. I like Starbucks to an extent. But that's not necessarily a stereotype. That's just something you've been heavily advertised. So how can you avoid that? Pumpkin spice, yoga pants. These aren't things which are what's the word? Synonymous with being white. These are just things with living within the culture which you live in. What else was it? You enjoy Pitch Perfect. Again, this is advertising. Nutella. All these kinds of things. There was a few things which I found interesting, kind of like you maintained a Tumblr account or a Pinterest account, you're interested in that kind of thing. Your Tinder profile says you love traveling. You own a horse. These are little things. But again, I found that incredibly interesting in terms of kind of how we see ourselves. But there's also, I read a few articles about this whole culture shift, and in a way this podcast just completely feeds into that. A lot of white people are recognizing their whiteness more, or recognizing white culture more, in such a way that it's becoming a whole conversation. There's a whole like NPR podcast about, can we talk about whiteness? And yeah, it's just opened up this whole conversation. Wes Anderson movies are apparently extremely white, and I've never really thought of them as extremely white. But maybe that's just because I'm naturally in the white culture. It's all, I don't know. That's a question like mid-podcast. We look at other societies and we look at the cultures and other races, and we see that people have this passion and pride for themselves. And whereas it's never been something I really felt I needed to define, in the same way that I never really had to answer whether I was white enough, it's never concerned me. There's never been anyone in my society who's gone, "Oh, Graham, you're not really white enough." I mean, I am as bright as the sun in paleness. But yeah, it's never really been something where I felt, I have to define it. And that again comes back, that can pull back to the whole idea of privilege, and that I've never had to define it because I've never been at risk of losing it in a way. There's huge amount of British stereotypes of which people get really upbeat and angry over, and this idea of you're losing British culture and all this kind of stuff. And in a way, you could say the British culture is white culture because of the predominantly white society. But at the same time, to me, the message has always been that British culture is extremely multicultural, and the culture we have shaped has been based on our colonial history, which basically came with stealing everything. So again, we end up in this vague period of where our culture is just to ingratiate everything else into it, not to maintain it. Why would you maintain something? Just keep letting it evolve and evolve. We lose things. Oh, shit, we lose Ugg boots along the way. It's not the biggest tragedy in the world. Oh no, you can't make a roast. Oh, of course you can make a roast. Just go out and make a roast if you want to make a roast. No one's stopping you. No one's going to come into your house and say you're not allowed to do it because it's not culturally appropriate. Sorry, getting on a little bit of a rant. Back to this article. So this article which I read starts off with a very similar message, which I thought of, that whiteness is hard to define. It's extremely hard to define. So this article comes from Mona, Chalabi? Yeah, Mona Chalabi. I'm going to go with Chalabi. Apologies if it's wrong. I don't know if she'll ever even see this podcast of me rambling about my race. And it kind of came from her, and she describes if she, after a few months of moving to New York, a magical conversation happened that would radically shift her psyche forever. And she was telling a friend that she'd gone to a favourite shop, and he asked her, "Who served you? Was it a tall white guy?" And this confused her, because no one had ever really used white as a descriptive term off the bat. You say I go to the shop and I was served with some guy. If you're in the UK, you would assume it was white. You would assume the person who served you was white unless specified otherwise. And that's because, this article says that as a country, it's 86% white. In terms of the national ethnicity of the UK, in 2011, it was 86% white. And that's the standard. In school, I went to school. I can only remember a couple of non-white people within my school. College, it was a bit more diverse because you bring so many schools together. But for the most part, the people who you were seeing in illustration were all white. The people who you were seeing kind of on the TV, everyone's white. it was never a thing. The way people were presented as other cultures were usually, for the most part, presented as enemies or on Crime Watch. And that's the message you were driven to. It's gotten a lot better in the last few years due to people being more aware, but overall, that's a huge thing. But getting back to the kind of the nitty gritty, in a way, white as a culture feels like kind of like an absence. As I say, it's an absence of a definitive answer. But I found some of the answers which are in this really, really interesting. So this was a lot of this information is based on the US, but it likely applies to us anyway because we're all kind of like mixed into the whole Western culture ideology. But, what do white people eat? Vegetables. That's apparently what white people eat. According to the US Department of Agriculture, latest data shows that the average white American eats 16 pounds more vegetables at home each year than other non-white Americans. Now, what is interesting is a lot of these statistics also kind of give you an insight into other stereotypes and other cultural problems which kind of blend into. So from the statistic that most white people eat vegetables, there's also another statistic that, the obesity factor in the US, but most people are eating vegetables. Then why are they so obese? And it's because, the way theirs works, some things are classed as vegetables, some which probably shouldn't be classed as vegetables. You class a potato fries, it's a vegetable. It's still a fry, though, isn't it? What do white people drink? Alcohol. In terms of drinking culture in the UK, we have a huge drinking culture. Binge drinking originated in the UK as a term. The whole idea of people getting passed out when they were like 11 years old, house parties, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, that I can completely agree. That as a white person, alcohol is probably one of the defining factors of our culture. Typical white name, according to this, the most typical white name is Joseph Yoder. That's Yoda as in Yoder. And that was based on a census which was done in the US. So it kind of blends. The other list of white names is Kruger, Mueller, Koch, Schwartz, Schmidt, Novak, Schneider, Schroeder, and Haas. Now, that is quite diverse for the UK. In the US, that's fairly synonymous. You've got a nice mix there of different white background names. In the UK, obviously, that's completely different because we haven't had the influx of immigration from Europe, which the US had. There's a lot of German names in there, a lot of Jewish names in there, and that's not as prevalent within the UK. Carrying on, going down the old list. What do white people enjoy and do for fun? And now this was one which it's going to be obvious why this appealed to me. So apparently, as white people, we enjoyed the arts more than any other culture. Now, do we enjoy the arts more than any other culture because we're higher up, because we're high class? No. Or do we enjoy the arts more because we got access to it? For the longest time, we've controlled the cultural landscape of art within most countries where we reside due to colonialism and due to privilege and due to things like that. So this whole idea that we enjoy arts the most is quite skewed and gives you a huge reflection of our history. And where we kind of come from, to the point of maybe we should feel, I don't know, should we feel guilty about enjoying the arts as much as we do? It's like that. There is a cliche of white boys and guitars and rock music. And why is that a thing? If I'd grown up to this point and I'd never bought a guitar, you can see one literally in the video next to me, like in the mirror. There it is. Fingers just wiggling on it right now. I own three guitars. I was about to say two. I own three guitars. If I'd never bought a guitar, would that make me less white? If I'd never been in a rock band, would that make me less white? I went to a rap show. Does that make me less white? In a way, judging by the crowd, that makes me more white. The fact that I went to a rap show, could I have avoided being more white? Cultured? I don't know. It's a whole paradox. There's a massive paradox here of how this kind of all interlinks. By being involved in other cultures and wanting to explore them and see what identity is within them, and that's something everyone does as a teenager. Generally, most people in the white community at least, you explore other cultures because you're searching for your identity. So you're like, hell, I'm just going to go see what everyone else is doing and see how that applies to me. Doing that makes you more white. Wanting to explore that and yet not exploring that is also very white. Again, it comes down to this vagueness, the vagueness of white culture, which is the title of this podcast. And how I've never had to define this. I've never had to define whether I'm white or not based on just my interests and my background. The statistics she bears here are based on people living within the US, that people go to more music, they go to more museums, and then got more access to these things. And then, at the same time, she quotes the racial statistics of people who kind of have access to it. And in the US, at least, there's a lot less people of Hispanic and African American background who have access to this kind of stuff. They don't. And I don't know how that works in the UK because I've never been black in the UK. Maybe you have. Tell me what you think. I don't. But it's interesting as a topic. I don't feel it's like something I'm ever going to solve. It's just something which I kind of wanted to talk about and broach about and see if other people feel the same. How do you define it? I've realized that I could be opening the absolute doors for racists and bigots right now. So if you're a racist or a bigot, please kindly fuck off. But yeah, there's a whole gauge on it. How do you gauge whiteness? I can almost guarantee, because as humans, what we do is we look at everything and we kind of gauge things and we look for patterns and we look for definitions in things. I guarantee that if I was able to get a non-white person to come discuss this with me, they could define it. They could tell me what they see as white culture. And I think it would shock quite a few people. If you're not white and you're wanting to come on the podcast and talk to me about this, please do, because I want to have this conversation. I feel like it's one of these things which needs to be out there, needs to be discussed. It needs to be not at the forefront of anything, because in a way it's a silly discussion of just people feeling insecure about being white and trying to lose being white. And it's like, well, none of that really matters, guys. Don't worry about it. Again, another part of white culture is just completely ignoring our culture. But maybe you think different. Maybe you think it's the best thing in the world and there's a real clear definition to it. I don't know. I'm just a white boy. But go listen to Chris Sanders. Go listen to his thoughts on race. Go read that article. I'll leave a link in the description of every page I'm looking at. It's incredibly interesting. And, can sit and consider it. Maybe don't, but maybe do. I don't know. I'm just trying to wax lyrical and figure out kind of how I feel about it. And at the moment, I don't know. It's still very undefined. Until then, we're just kind of still just yelling at concrete. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.